Hello, welcome to another episode of Shattered Lives, Reach Ireland's crime podcast for the Irish Daily Star and the Irish Mirror. I'm crime and defence editor Michael O'Toole, and I'm joined today by our crime correspondent Paul Healy. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Mick.
So we have an awful lot of evidence to go through. We're obviously covering the latest day of I think it's day 7 of the trial of Jozef Puska, who is on trial at the Central Criminal Court. And the allegation is that he murdered Ashling Murphy on the 12th of January 2022. Now, Mr. Puska is a 33-year-old from Lynally Grove in Mucklagh in County Offaly. And as I say, he was on trial in front of the Special Central Criminal Court, and he denies the murder of Ashling Murphy. Now, it's a jury of 3 women and 9 men, and the trial judge is Mr. Justice Tony Hunt. So as I said, today was day 7, and there was quite a lot to go through. We normally go chronologically, but we've decided to go sort of forward, to go back, I suppose. And we're going to talk about, Paul's going to talk about 2 technical Gardai from the technical side of the force who gave evidence today. Detective Sergeant Michael Ryan, and then a Detective Garda Ciaran Byrne.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Mick, there are 2 key witnesses in relation to this particular piece of evidence, and this is in relation to a mobile phone device and a Fitbit smartwatch device that are associated with Miss Murphy. And we heard evidence from both of these members of Garda Síochána. They are members of the National Cyber Crime Bureau of Garda Síochána, and they were tasked with basically breaking into these items, into the phone and into the watch, to be able to see what's on them, and to establish who the owner is. I mean, obviously they suspected that it was Miss Murphy. They were able to confirm that it belonged to an account in her name, and we'll go through that in forensic detail in a moment. But just they went through the evidence of this Fitbit watch in particular, and I suppose the last movements, what it detected on that watch, ultimately the last movements. That is what it's alleged by the state, the last movements of Ashling Murphy on that day, on the 12th of January 2022.
So
I think
it's fair to say that Detective Garda Ryan Detective Garda Byrne gave the bulk of the evidence today. But before that, Detective Sergeant Michael Ryan from the Cybercrime Bureau was on. So would you maybe just go through very briefly what he said?
Yes, so Detective Sergeant Ryan just kind of outlined that he would be, I suppose, the head of the cybercrime unit, and he was involved in the examination of the mobile phone and of the Fitbit watch just initially. And he said that he was actually shown the watch and the phone in court, so he saw them kind of bagged up, and he just confirmed that they're the same items that he examined. He was made aware, obviously, of the investigation in Tullamore, and he was able to basically see that it's confirmed that the phone was linked to an account, an email address, Ashling Murphy 1998, I think at hotmail.com was the email address, the court was told. So he said he managed to gain access, and he connected to the Fitbit on a Garda laptop, and he synchronized the smartwatch then, and he downloaded what he called residue data from it, and he was able to extract a password then from that and accessed the Fitbit account. And he said the password was actually located on Miss Murphy's phone in a clear text format. And then he explained that it was his colleague, Detective Garda Ciaran Byrne, who he tasked with accessing that Fitbit account and examining it in detail.
And I think he would have told the court that he was aware Miss Murphy was wearing a Fitbit on the day she died.
Yes, so he was privy to that information from the investigating Gardaí, and obviously then he was handed that particular item that was found on her body at the time.
And it was a Fitbit Versa 3.
A Fitbit Versa 3 device, yeah. So Detective Garda Ciaran Byrne, he was on the stand for quite a bit today, and as I mentioned, he is the Garda who looked into this Fitbit account and was able to access that account after they got the password from the phone. So there's an app on Miss Murphy's phone for Fitbit, and that was attached to the particular device. So the detective Garda just kind of outlined, because it's not easy to show the data as it appeared. So he made a series of graphs outlining each particular piece of data that they were able to extract from this Fitbit watch device. And that was in relation to heartbeat, in relation to direction and pace of the last movements of Miss Murphy. And in particular, I suppose, maybe the most harrowing evidence, certainly harrowing for the family of Miss Murphy, who are seated behind me, was in relation to the heartbeat, to the actual heart rate on this Fitbit device, because it detected what the state is saying is the last movements, as I say, and the last heart rate of Miss Murphy herself. And we will go into this in a bit of detail in a minute, but he just outlined at the outset that there was a consistent pace. And then at around 3:21 p.m. on that day, the heart rate decreased and was no longer recording a heartbeat. The Fitbit was no longer recording a heartbeat at 3:31 p.m.
So just to go slightly backwards, I think the detective said he would have, to calibrate this, he would have used another Fitbit, and he would have taken the same route that the GPS from the Fitbit mapped out. So there was essentially a plotted map or a plotted graph of the walk that Miss Murphy took on her last days.
Yeah, so this is interesting. Obviously, apart from in investigating the device itself, Detective Garda Byrne went out to the scene, he said, and tracked the route of Ashling Murphy to just examine and to ensure that the route was accurate on the watch. They had purchased the same make and model watch, and he wore it himself, and he did that route to see that it was accurate to the same route that was recorded on Miss Murphy's watch. And then we saw this graph that was put up on the screen, and you could see a silhouette of a person and basically each individual plot point. So the first one was the direction, the route in which Miss Murphy took, and there's individual points of interest on that, which was basically for each kilometer that she passed, and then other things of note. So it showed as I mentioned, the GPS, the elevation, the speed, and the heart rate were all individual different graphs that the Garda had mapped out and went through in detail.
And I thought it was interesting. Listeners will remember that there was CCTV footage last Friday when I was in court of Miss Murphy parking at the Dangan Road car park and then walking over the Whitehall Bridge and then the footbridge over the canal, over onto the other side of the canal. And if I recall, that was at roughly 14:50. And I noted with interest that your tweets that Detective Garda said effectively the same time as 14:51 that she started. Basically, so she basically got out of her car. We know she drove there from school. She basically got out of her car at 14:51.
Yeah, now it's hard to describe this, what we were seeing, but thankfully the Garda did go through this in detail. But that we could see this map of the route along the canal, and you could see the start point was at the car park, as you mentioned, and then her exercise started as she came in onto the walkway into the canal. And it shows that the Fitbit device showed that her exercise began at 2:51 p.m. coming from the car park into the canal and walking, what we were told, in a westerly direction over the bridge, as you mentioned, and then traveling easterly. And we heard that ultimately she did turn around at one point when she got to Digby's Bridge and came back then in the direction that she had been going. That basically did the other half of her walk coming back the way she came.
Yeah, maybe we could expand on this. So she went westerly first to go over the two bridges, but then she sort of got to the other side of the canal and headed eastwards along the canal up the Digsby Bridge. And I think the Garda gave evidence she would have gone under the overpass or the flyover for the N52. It's a bridge basically going over the canal. She walked along the canal for probably 2 kilometers to Digby Bridge and then turned back on herself, heading back to the Dangan Road car park.
Yeah, and then as I mentioned, there were individual points of interest on this map, which were basically things that the device recorded. So you might if you have a Fitbit device yourself, it records for each kilometer that you do. So there was at 3:01 p.m. she did her first kilometer, and then by 3:20 p.m. she had done 3 kilometers. What Garda Byrne noted of interest is that at 3:21 p.m. then that is when the consistency of the journey stopped. He said there was no longer consistent values and that the watch was showing what he termed as erratic, violent movement. And it appeared to be swaying in a constant manner, he said, at 3:21 p.m. So up until that point, she appeared to be going at the same pace. Everything was traveling in a consistent manner, and then 3:21 is when everything is alleged, according to the device and the evidence given in court. That's when everything changed. So he said, as he mentioned, as we already mentioned, he did do that route himself, and he was able to determine that exact spot where Miss Murphy was at 3:21 p.m. is where her memorial now stands. So there's if anyone has been down to that area of the canal, there is a bench there with Ashling Murphy's name on it and a picture of her, and it's a memorial shrine for her, the spot where she is alleged to have been murdered. And according to the detective guard on stand today, that is the same spot where at 3:21 the device records this erratic movement.
And I think the detective said that the location, maybe, I think, is it for 10 minutes, it doesn't really move. Obviously, I mean, just looking at your notes there, Paul, at 15:16, she seems to have turned at Digby Bridge and headed back westwards towards Tullamore. At 15:21, it becomes erratic. But I think he says after that, there's no real, it effectively doesn't move from that spot.
Yes, it effectively doesn't move from that spot. And that is where her heart rate changes as well. So as I mentioned, the heart rate stuff was particularly harrowing in that we heard that there was changes in her heart rate. So her heart rate started at about 100 beats per minute, and it then increased gradually as she did her exercise. And then when it came to, as I said, this 3:21 p.m., it's decreasing. And we then heard that there was a slight increase at 3:27 p.m. It went up and down then until 3:31 p.m. when there was no longer any heart rate picked up by this particular Fitbit device. Now, in relation to that, just Michael Bowman, senior counsel for Mr. Puska, did challenge about the accuracy of such a device. And he pointed out, he said that is his understanding that the company Fitbit themselves, and that they don't say that this should be used in any kind of scientific or medical manner, the accuracy of it as such. The detective guard just pointed to his own evidence and the route that he took, and his understanding of it, that it is within about 10% accurate in terms of heartbeat and the data that it produces. But Mr. Bowman was just pointing out that the data from a Fitbit cannot necessarily be determined to be scientifically or medically accurate to a person's, actual heart rate, and so that was something that he pointed out when cross-examining the witness.
So that was the end of Detective Garda Byrne's evidence, was it?
That was the end of his evidence in particular. Yeah, that was that took up a significant amount of time today, because it's easier to sum up, as I was explaining in the podcast. We see a lot of graphs and stuff, and that takes a period of time. So maybe we should go back, because there's a lot of other evidence today in relation to the day after Miss Murphy's killing, and that is we've mentioned this before already. There has been evidence about an incident that happened at a house in Crumlin the day after in relation to Mr. Puska.
So, Paul, thanks for that. That was the end of Detective Garda Byrne's evidence. So maybe we should go backwards to go forward, shall we say, and go to the first witness of the day, who was a gentleman from Slovakia.
Yes, so this gentleman's name is Rostislav Patuka, and he is a Slovakian national and a bus driver in the Tullamore area. And we heard that he is a family friend of Jozef Puska's family. And his evidence was in relation to an alleged encounter that he says he had with Jozef Puska the night of the night that Miss Murphy had been killed earlier in the day, so the night of the 12th. And in relation to his evidence, he said that he was basically he gave two statements to the Gardai. So in his first statement, he told Gardai that he had last had an encounter with Jozef Puska on the 11th. And we then heard that he actually subsequently gave evidence, that he subsequently spoke to Gardai again and told them that he had actually met Mr. Puska on the night of the 12th, and that Mr. Puska had come to his house around about 9 o'clock at night and had called to his door, and he appeared to be wet, and that he had blood coming out of him, and he looked as though he had been in a fight. He said he looked blue in the face, and he looked like something bad had happened to him. And he was asked, just, I'm kind of going a bit out of chronological order here, but people might be wondering, why did he give a second statement? Why didn't he say that the first time? He was asked about this in cross-examination, and basically said that he was in fear for his family and for his children, that there had been a lot of stuff that was going on social media at the time, and Mr. Michael Bowman, senior counsel, had said that things were ugly. Is it fair to say that things were ugly in Tullamore at that time? And he said more than that. As he said, he felt fear for his family. So I mentioned he was a bus driver, that he drove kids, school kids, and he felt that parents in Tullamore had entrusted him with their children, and that he had heard in the news and on social media that a Romanian national had been arrested at that point in time. We heard mention of that already. And so he was concerned about coming forward with the information that he knew, but he ultimately made the decision to go back to the Gardai and tell them that Mr. Puska had come to his home on the night of the 12th around 9 o'clock at night, and that he looked like he had been in a fight, the blood coming out of him, and that the circumstances were unusual. He said that Mr. Puska was scared, and it wasn't like him to be acting the way he was. So he said he had Mr. Puska was wet, scratched in the face, and the scratches were bleeding, and that Mr. Puska was basically coming to his home to ask him for a lift home. So, you know, Mr. Puska has an address in Lynally Grove there in Mucklagh in County Offaly, and he was asking Mr. Ratuka, who we heard in court that Mr. Ratuka is often referred to as Peter, so he's known locally as Peter, and that's the name that he uses. And he basically says that Mr. Puska asked him for a lift home.
And did Mr. Puska tell him, or was his evidence that Mr. Puska told him he had been in a fight?
Yes, so he said he looked like he'd been in a fight, and that Mr. Puska told him that he had been in a fight. And he said that Mr. Puska responded with that when he asked him what had happened to him. He said that he didn't look right, and he was thinking something had happened to him. And he asked him, you know, well, why didn't you call the guards? And Mr. Puska didn't really give him a satisfactory answer on that. He said he didn't really get much out of Mr. Puska, and that he drove him home, and on the drive home, he actually asked him 20 times for more information, but he wasn't getting, he said Mr. Puska wasn't really giving him details as to what had happened. So he dropped them. They were to Lynally Grove, and we heard that just as they got to the roundabout just before the house, that Mr. Puska asked him to slow down in case there was somebody there outside the house. And he said, well, you know, why would you be worried about someone at your house if you did nothing wrong? And Mr. Puska again didn't divulge an answer to that. And he brought him to the house, and Mr. Puska went in, and the last thing Mr. Puska said to him was, I'll sort you out tomorrow. And he saw him then go into the house. And that was the end of his interaction with Mr. Puska that night. Then we got into the cross-examination, and we heard about the alleged ugly atmosphere in Tullamore, you know, and the reason why he didn't divulge this information in the first place. And the arrest of this Romanian national, as I said.
Okay. And so who is the next? That was the end of his evidence, basically.
Sorry, I meant to, yeah, so I just want to mention, sorry, just in relation to the car, he said that when Mr. Puska was in the car with him, that he was physically shaking, and he could tell that there was something wrong. The colour was out of his face. And he also was asked by Mr. Bowman in cross-examination, did he appear to have any injuries to his stomach, stab injuries? And he said he can just recall Mr. Puska was holding his stomach at the time. And we heard then that the judge intervened in this. Mr. Justice Hunt did ask, are you saying, or are you under instructions from your client that he was at this point injured? That is the night of the 12th. And he said that instructions are different from evidence. And Mr. Bowman said, well, he is, of course, acting on instructions from his client. So his client is, Mr. Puska is alleging that when he called to the house at this point in time, that he had the stab injuries to his abdomen that we've heard about at that time. And we'll come back to that now when we speak about the next evidence.
So that's his position, essentially, that he was stabbed when he met Peter, the Slovakian man.
Yes.
On the 12th,
On the 12th.
before he went to Crumlin in South Dublin.
Yes.
But let's go to Crumlin. So as you say, the next witness we're going to go to is Detective Garda Kevin O'Shaughnessy from Crumlin Garda Station. And on the 13th of January, so the day after the death of Miss Murphy, he gave evidence that he was called to a house in Crumlin. He attended an incident there in the Armagh Road.
Yeah, so we've mentioned this incident at the Armagh Road before, but we've come back to it now indeed. So we've heard from paramedics in relation to this, and from, as I said, members of Dublin Fire Brigade and the National Ambulance Service who attended to this house and found Mr. Puska. We mentioned this in the previous podcast, that he was leaning over a bedside locker and that he appeared to have stab injuries. So these are the Gardaí that called to the house, and Detective Garda Kevin O'Shaughnessy was one of them. And he said that at 11:20 a.m. he received a call to attend the incident. They initially arrived at the wrong address, but then they were directed to the correct address. He went into the bedroom, and he said he found a man slouched with his head on the bed and that he was screaming in pain. Excuse me, sorry. And he said he allowed the ambulance personnel in to treat Mr. Puska. He then went in up to the hall to the living area, and he met a couple of other relatives. There were 2 women and an elderly male, he said, and one of the women, and Marianne was her name. She basically interpreted for him. She was the only person able to speak English in the house, and she identified the injured man as being her relative, Jozef Puska. So the Garda says he went. He'd been told that Mr. Puska had presented at so this address was his parents' home, and that he presented there the previous evening. And he then saw Mr. Puska being brought out to the ambulance, and he said that's when he noticed the marks on his face. And just in cross-examination, he was asked just to confirm that it was Mr. Puska's father's home, and that this person, we've heard about this translator before, just that this person was actually a female translator, that she was a female relative of Mr. Puska.
Okay, so the next witness was Garda Keith Brennan, who's also from Crumlin Garda Station.
Yeah, so Garda Keith Brennan as well also attended the home, and so he said that Mr. Puska was actually lying with his knees on the ground and his face on the bed. He identified himself as an armed Garda and instructed Mr. Puska to show his hands because he couldn't see his hands, and he said that the accused then did show his hands and that he was making groaning noises, and he was unable really to talk because he was in such pain. The ambulance personnel came in, placed him on the bed, and this particular witness said that he could see a stab wound just below Mr. Puska's belly button. He went out and met Miss Marianne. She is the relative who could speak English, and they went in and had the conversation with Mr. Puska, a very brief conversation. And he said that sorry, I'm losing my place. He said that Marianne said she had a conversation with Mr. Puska's wife the previous evening, and he was informed by her that Mr. Puska's wife had tried to go to a Garda station to report him missing. And that's subsequent to that, then they went in and tried to have a conversation with Mr. Puska, and he asked him, "Where did you get your injuries?" And the accused said, "Blanchardstown." And he said he had alleged that he had received those injuries in the Blanchardstown area of Dublin.
Okay, so I think we're on witness 6, and I think this was the final witness of the day, and that's Garda Sergeant Paul McDonnell, who I believe is also from Blanchardstown Station.
Yes.
He's from Blanchardstown Station, sorry. The others were from Crumlin.
The others, yeah, the other Gardaí that attended the scene were from Crumlin, and then Sergeant McDonnell was from Blanchardstown Garda Station. So he told the court that he was alerted to an incident that had happened at Blanchardstown Shopping Centre on the 12th of January, so the same day that Miss Murphy was killed. And this incident happened at the shopping centre in Blanchardstown in the evening on the 12th of January, and it was a stabbing incident, and he was told that 2 people had been injured in that stabbing. He was alerted then also to the presence injured in an incident in Blanchardstown, and this Garda obviously put 2 and 2 together and thought this particular person in the hospital may be a victim of the stabbing incident that happened at Blanchardstown shopping centre. So himself and his colleague, they went to James's hospital. They went to the A&E and they asked to see Mr. Puska. And they went into a room and found Mr. Puska there in a bed, asleep. And they alerted him, woke him up. He said he woke up straight away, and he immediately was cooperative in speaking to them. And he described him as being in a good humour. Now, he realized that they had been told ahead of time that Mr. Puska was a Slovakian national. So they had arranged for a translator to basically have an interpreter over the phone. So they had a conversation with Mr. Puska with this interpreter on the phone. And they basically asked him, could he assist in telling them what had happened to him and what had happened in this incident in Blanchardstown. So he says Mr. Puska told him that he came from the Tullamore area to the Dublin area in and around Houston Station, and that he then took a taxi to the Blanchardstown area. And he said that he got out of this taxi and he was immediately set upon and assaulted by two males. He was then asked, could he give a description of these two males? And he gave a description of the first male, but he was unable to give a description of the second male. A quote I have here from the sergeant is, he told me in simple terms that he was assaulted. So he also believed his phone was stolen during the incident, as he said he didn't have it on him. And he said he was very shook and that he returned to his father's address that evening in the Crumlin area, but he couldn't recall exactly how he got there.
And did he give an indication as to why he was going to Blanchardstown? He was going to meet somebody, was he?
He said that he was going to meet a woman. He wasn't able to tell the Garda who this woman was, the identity of this lady. And similarly, he couldn't say or couldn't remember or couldn't recall how he got to the house in Crumlin.
But he indicated that he had injuries in his abdomen, and he pointed to those injuries, and he gave an explanation as to what he believes happened to him.
Yes, he pointed to the injuries on his abdomen and stomach, and we heard that he was kind of bandaged up in that area at that point. And he indicated that he got those injuries from the incident in Blanchardstown. So the sergeant then asked, could he take a photograph of Mr. Puska's hand, which he said had distinctive cup marks on it. And he took a photograph of that hand. And we actually saw that photograph was shown to the jury in the courtroom today. He said that there were similar marks on the other hand, and that he had marks to his head. He kind of had red marks on his head and on his hands.
And I believe the Garda said that Mr. Puska was in an increased state of discomfort during the conversation.
Yeah, so at this point, an alarm actually went off, and this disrupted their conversation because Mr. Puska seemed to be in an increased sense of discomfort, as you mentioned. And with the alarm going off, the attention of the on-duty nurse was then, they got the attention of the on-duty nurse, and that ended their conversation basically with Mr. Puska. So the sergeant, he went back to Blanchardstown Garda Station and he relayed to his colleagues what had happened. And his colleague actually made a connection about what we were told at that stage was the well-publicised death of Ashling Murphy. And that his colleague then made the connection between the incident with Mr. Puska and what happened to Miss Murphy. We may go into this. I am sure his colleague will be called as a witness to relay that, but that's as much as we heard in relation to that. The sergeant, he later went back to Blanchardstown Garda Station because he was asked about the clothes that Mr. Puska was wearing. He obviously wasn't wearing the clothes when he was in the ward, when he was in the A&E, but he went back to see if he could establish the clothing that Mr. Puska was wearing. So he was told by a consultant that Mr. Puska had been transferred for treatment, and then he was going to be brought back to a recovery ward. He asked for access to the CCTV, but he was told by this particular consultant that he would need a search warrant for that. And that basically concluded his evidence and the evidence for today.
Okay, and we're back tomorrow?
We'll be back tomorrow. Yeah, I'm sure there will be further Garda witnesses. We heard at the outset of this case by prosecuting counsel Miss Lawler, Anne-Marie Lawler, that the accused is alleged to have made a confession in hospital. We haven't got to that point now in the case, but obviously we're talking about the alleged incident in the hospital, and we know that the prosecution's case is that there is an alleged confession. So I expect we'll be hearing more about that, if not tomorrow, certainly in the coming days.
Yeah, we'll see what tomorrow brings. And just a reminder that Mr. Justice Tony Hunt said he expects the case to be, or the extent of the case to be, the 10th of November. So that's Friday week.
It is indeed.
Okay, so we'll be back again. I'll be covering the case tomorrow. You're on something else, Paul. So we'll be talking again probably tomorrow evening.
We will. Thanks as ever for listening.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks to Ciaran Bradley, our producer.